I'm sorry, Tom. Script only buys what's in the store. That's the rule. Tom Henderson stood at the counter of the Warren Company store, his calloused hands holding a stack of colorful paper currency. His daughter had been coughing for 3 days straight, the kind of wet rattle that meant lung fever if left untended. The medicine he needed sat in Doc Harrison's office 2 miles down the valley, where real money changed hands. Just enough to cover the medicine, Tom said quietly. I'll work extra shifts. The clerk, a thin man named Peters, shook his head with what might have been genuine sympathy. Can't do it. Tom, you know that. Company script's good for anything we stock: flour, beans, coffee, fabric. But medicine, that's outside goods. Tom looked down at the bright bills in his hands. $15 in Warren Mining Company currency. Each note decorated with an engraving of the mine entrance and Douglas Warren's signature. Worthless anywhere beyond this counter. He put the script back in his pocket and selected a tin of honey instead. Sometimes honey helped with coughs. Sometimes. The store was warm despite the December cold pressing against its windows. Shelves lined with goods all priced 40% higher than the Mercantile in Silverton. Though none of the miners had time to make that journey even if they could. Work ran dawn to dusk 6 days a week. Sundays were for rest, church, and shopping here above the store. In an office with a potbelly stove and a view of the entire camp, Douglas Warren reviewed his quarterly ledgers. The numbers satisfied him. Production steady despite the winter complications. Store revenue up 8% from last quarter. Worker turnover at an acceptable 12% annually, low enough to maintain experienced crews. High enough to prevent the kind of entrenched workforce that grew demanding. He ran his finger down a column of figures. Script issued versus script redeemed. The gap pleased him. Workers who couldn't spend all their wages elsewhere had to spend them here. Simple economics. Loyalty through necessity. Warren was 53. Square-shouldered and gray at the temples. He'd inherited the mine from his father 20 years ago and had run it the same way, firm but fair. As he understood fairness. Every man who worked had shelter, access to goods, steady employment. What more could they reasonably want? Through his window he could see the camp spreading below. 32 worker cabins arranged in neat rows, smoke rising from cook stoves, lanterns beginning to glow as the winter afternoon dimmed toward dark. He felt the proprietor's satisfaction of a man who'd built something substantial. On his desk, a telegram from Chicago. Arriving Thursday, Thomas. Warren smiled. His son. Home from university after 18 months. The boy would be 24 now, nearly finished with his studies. Perhaps ready to learn the practical side of the business, to understand how frontier mining actually worked rather than how economics professors theorized it should. He closed the ledger and locked it in the safe behind his desk. Outside, the camp settled into evening. Miners returning from the day shift, their faces cold dark, their bodies bent with exhaustion. They lined up at the company store for their evening purchases. Script changing hands, goods going into canvas sacks. Warren descended the stairs to walk home through the camp. Men nodded to him respectfully. He returned the gestures with dignified acknowledgement. This was the natural order management in labor, each understanding their place. His house stood apart from the workers' cabins, larger and better insulated, with glass windows instead of oiled paper. Inside, a housekeeper had left his supper warming on the stove. He ate alone, as he had since his wife passed 4 years ago. Before bed, he checked the ledgers one more time, all balanced, all orderly, all as it should be. He didn't think of Tom Henderson, or the child coughing 2 miles away from medicine. The system worked. The numbers proved it. The delegation arrived on a Tuesday morning. 5 men in work clothes still dusted with coal. Douglas Warren watched them approach from his office window. Recognizing the deliberate pace of men who'd rehearsed what they meant to say, Michael O'Brien led them, 35, Irish by extraction, and too well-spoken for his station. Warren had noticed him before the man who could cite Shakespeare in the saloon, who'd supposedly attended some workers' college back east before coming west. Troublesome, potentially, but a good miner. "Gentlemen," Warren said when Peters showed them into his office, "what can I do for you?" O'Brien removed his cap. "We appreciate your time. Mr. Warren, we've come to make a request. Go on. We'd like the mine to convert to cash wages, United States currency, paid weekly or biweekly, at the rate currently assigned to our scrip compensation. Warren leaned back in his chair, so it had finally come to this. That's not how we operate here. We know what's due, sir. We're asking if you'd consider changing the practice. O'Brien's voice remained level, respectful. Other mines in the territory pay cash wages, the operation in Leadville. The copper works in Bisbee. Other mines can run themselves however they see fit. Warren interrupted. This mine operates on company script because it's practical and it works. You have access to everything you need right here in camp. No need to travel to town. No risk of losing wages to gamblers or whiskey sellers. But no freedom to save, either, O'Brien said quietly. No ability to send money to family back east. No way to accumulate enough to buy land or start a business. A man paid in script can never improve his situation. Mr. Warren, he can only work. A man who works hard and lives sensibly will do fine under any wage system, Warren said. This is standard practice throughout the mining districts, has been for decades. The oldest miner in the delegation spoke up, William Hutchins, white-haired and weathered. Been working your mine 15 years. Mr. Warren, good years. Mostly, but I got nothing saved. No way to retire. No way to help my daughter when she married. Every dollar I earn comes back to you through the store. The store provides quality goods at fair prices. O'Brien reached into his pocket and placed 2 coins on Warren's desk. Silver dollars, bright and clean. Beside them, he laid company script 5 $1 notes. Colorful and crisp. Which would you accept as payment for your labor? Warren? The question hung in the air. Warren felt his jaw tighten. That's impertinent. It's honest. Sir, with respect, you wouldn't work for script. Why should we? Because those are the terms of employment. If you don't like them, you're free to seek work elsewhere. Are we? O'Brien's voice remained calm, but something harder entered it. William there owes the company store $18. Charlie Brennan owes $23. Most men in this camp carry debt that keeps growing despite working 6 days a week. A man who can't save or leave isn't employed. Mr. Warren, he's owned. Warren stood. That's enough. I've listened to your request and my answer is no. The script system is economically sound and it will continue. If you have complaints about store prices or working conditions, bring them through proper channels. But I won't be lectured about economics by... He stopped himself, but the unspoken words echoed anyway. By miners, by workers, by men who didn't understand business. O'Brien collected his coins and script from the desk. We appreciate your time, Mr. Warren. The delegation filed out, caps in hands, dignity in their silence. Warren watched them go, feeling irritation and something else, a faint unease he couldn't quite name. The word owned stuck in his mind like a burr. He turned to the window, looking down at the camp. Men moving between cabins and mine entrance and store. From up here, they looked like pieces on a board. Components of a system that functioned smoothly because he'd designed it well. His father had run it this way. The mine in Nevada where Warren himself had worked as a young man had operated identically. Standard practice, sound economics, but the silver dollars gleamed in his memory. And he couldn't quite shake the image of Tom Henderson holding useless paper while his daughter coughed. He shook his head, dismissing the thought. Sentiment had no place in business. The numbers worked. That's what mattered. On his desk. The telegram about Thomas's arrival sat beside the quarterly reports. His son was studying economics at university. Perhaps he'd confirmed that Warren's methods were sound, that these workers simply didn't understand the larger picture. Warren returned to his ledgers, finding comfort in their ordered columns. By evening, he'd forgotten the delegation entirely, or convinced himself he had. Thomas Warren arrived on Thursday's afternoon stage, carrying 2 leather cases and a head full of theories his father didn't yet know he'd learned. The reunion was warm. Douglas embraced his son, noting the young man had filled out through the shoulders, that his handshake was firmer than when he'd left for Chicago. They walked up from the camp to the house, Thomas asking questions about the mine, about production, about the men. You'll see it all tomorrow, Douglas said. I'll take you through the operations. You can review the books if you like, see how a real mining concern runs, not just theory from lecture halls. I'd like that, Thomas said, and meant it, though not in the way his father assumed. That night over dinner, Douglas explained the business with pride, the geology of the coal seam, the timbering techniques they used, the efficient distribution system that kept workers supplied without need for outside trade. "We're completely self-sufficient," he said. "The men work. They're paid in company currency. They purchase what they need from the store. Simple, direct, no complications." "What about savings?" Thomas asked. "Savings. If a man wants to save money, how does he do it?" Douglas frowned. "Why would he need to? Everything he requires is available right here." Thomas didn't press. Not yet. But something in his chest tightened. The next 3 days he spent walking the camp. His father had given him freedom to observe. Proud to show what he'd built, Thomas observed carefully. He talked to miners coming off shift and asking about their work, their families. He visited the company store and quietly noted prices: flour at 45 cents a pound when the Silverton Mercantile charged 32. Coffee at $1.10 versus 70 cents in town. He did the arithmetic in his head, feeling sick. He met Tom Henderson's daughter. 8 years old and still coughing despite the honey her father had bought. The undertaker's wife mentioned 3 children in the camp with the same lung fever, all untreated because Doc Harrison wouldn't accept script. In the evenings, Thomas requested access to his father's ledgers. Douglas granted it gladly, expecting his educated son to appreciate the elegant bookkeeping. Thomas saw different numbers than his father did. He calculated actual wages versus purchasing power. A miner earning nominal $30 monthly in script could purchase approximately $21 worth of goods at fair market prices. That $9 gap, 30% of wages, disappeared into inflated store prices. Then the dead entries, workers borrowing against future wages for medical emergencies, for weddings, for funerals, the interest buried in the accounting, compounding monthly. Men who'd worked the mine for years with negative balances in their accounts. He found records of workers who'd tried to leave requests for final payment in cash, all denied per company policy. Men trapped by debt they could never clear because they were paid in currency that bought less than they earned. The system wasn't elegant, it was predatory. Thomas sat in his childhood bedroom, lamplight flickering, doing calculations until midnight. He drafted a letter to Dr. Sarah Klein, his economics professor at the University of Chicago. She'd spent 2 years researching frontier labor practices, documenting the script system's effects across mining territories. "I need your help," he wrote. "My father is a good man operating an evil system. He doesn't see it because he's never questioned it. Could you come present your research? Perhaps evidence from an objective source might reach him where my words won't." The next evening at dinner, Thomas broached the subject carefully. "I've been reviewing the books, Father." "Your accounting is impeccable," Douglas smiled. "Learn from the best. My father kept records you could audit by starlight. I noticed the company store revenue has increased steadily. Good management. Peters knows his inventory. The prices seem high compared to Silverton." Douglas set down his fork. "Transportation costs. We have to freight everything in. Plus, we're providing convenience. Men don't have to travel on their 1 day of rest. But they couldn't travel even if they wanted to. Most carry store debt because they live beyond their means." "Father," Thomas said gently, "they earn $30 but can only buy $21 worth of goods. How is that living beyond their means?" The silence stretched tight. Douglas's face hardened. "You've been here 4 days and you're lecturing me about business. I'm asking questions. You're implying I'm cheating my workers. I'm saying the system does, whether you intend it or not." Douglas stood from the table. "I've run this mine for 20 years, employed hundreds of men, kept this camp stable through panics and strikes and every kind of hardship. And you, fresh from university with chalk dust still on your shoes, presume to tell me I'm doing it wrong. I'm telling you there's a better way, based on what theory books written by professors who've never operated a business in their lives, based on research, data, real operations that have converted to cash wages and seen productivity increase. Show me. Thomas met his father's eyes. I will. Dr. Klein, my economics professor, has studied 20 mining operations across 3 territories. She's documented everything: productivity rates, worker retention, long-term profitability. She's the leading expert on frontier labor practices. Yes, Dr. Sarah Klein, and before you dismiss her because she's a woman, you should know she advises 3 territorial governments on mining policy. Douglas's expression cycled through surprise, skepticism, and something that might have been curiosity. You want to bring her here? I want you to listen to someone who isn't your son, someone with no personal stake in this, just evidence. For a long moment, Douglas said nothing. Then, stiffly, "Wire your professor. I'll give her 2 hours to make her case." "Thank you." "Don't thank me yet. If her research is as hollow as most academic nonsense, you'll both be on the next stage out." Thomas nodded, but something in his father's tone suggested the agreement cost more than pride. Perhaps, beneath the defensiveness, doubt had already begun its quiet work. That night, Thomas sent 2 telegrams, one to Dr. Klein in Chicago, the other to Michael O'Brien, asking if he'd be willing to meet not as delegation and owner, but as 2 men trying to find truth in complicated circumstances. The reply came within an hour. Wednesday evening, my cabin, come alone. The meeting in Douglas's office felt like a trial, though no one acknowledged it as such. Dr. Sarah Klein arrived on Tuesday, traveling with a trunk full of documentation and a certainty that came from knowing her data couldn't be disputed. She was 42, gray, streaking her dark hair, with the sharp eyes of someone who'd spent a career fighting to be taken seriously. Thomas made introductions. Douglas offered coffee with stiff formality, arranging chairs as if for a negotiation rather than a presentation. "Mr. Warren," Dr. Klein began, "I appreciate your willingness to hear my research. I know you're a busy man." "I'm a skeptical one," Douglas said. "No offense intended, but I've seen too many academics propose solutions that work beautifully on paper and fail catastrophically in practice. None taken. I share your skepticism of untested theory. That's why I've spent 2 years documenting actual operations, not proposing hypotheticals." She opened her first folder, spreading photographs across his desk. Mining camps, side by side. The contrast was immediate. These 2 operations are in similar territories, similar geology, similar markets. This one, she indicated the left photograph, uses company script. This one uses cash wages. Notice anything? Douglas leaned forward despite himself. The script system camp showed workers with hunched shoulders, cabins in disrepair, children in patched clothes standing hollow-eyed before the camera. The cash wage camp showed maintained buildings, workers who met the camera directly, and evidence of individual investment in surroundings. "Photographs can be staged," Douglas said. "They can. So I brought production data." Dr. Klein produced a ledger. "These are quarterly outputs over 3 years, starting from the point where the cash wage operation converted from script. Year 1, quarter 1 conversion happens. Output drops 8% as the system adjusts. By year 1, quarter 4 output matches previous levels. Year 2 output exceeds previous performance by 12%. Year 3, 18% above the script system baseline." "What about costs?" "Initial wage conversion increased labor costs by 14%, but reduced turnover saved 11% in training expenses. Fewer accidents from exhausted workers saved another 6% in medical costs and lost production. Net cost after 18 months actually 3% lower than the script system." Thomas watched his father process this, saw the reflexive disbelief warring with the evidence before him. "Why?" Douglas asked finally. "Why would paying cash wages improve productivity? Because dignity matters," Dr. Klein said simply. "A man who can save money, who has the freedom to make choices about his own labor and spending, works harder, not from fear of debt, but from hope of improvement. He invests in better equipment because he can afford it. He takes fewer sick days because he can afford doctors. He thinks of himself as a worker building something, not a resource being extracted. That's sentiment, not economics. It's both. The sentiment creates the economic outcome. She pulled out another document. Here's a mine in Wyoming. Owner similar to yourself, second generation. Inherited operation. Ran it by the same methods as his father. Converted to cash wages in 1885 after a minor labor dispute. Within 2 years, productivity increased so dramatically he expanded operations. Wrote to me last month saying the conversion was the best business decision he'd ever made. Douglas was quiet, studying the papers. Thomas held his breath. What about worker agitation? Douglas asked. Don't cash wages give men independence to organize, to make demands? They do, Dr. Klein acknowledged. But I've found that well-paid workers rarely organize for confrontation. They organize for voice, for safety committees, for community improvements. When men feel fairly treated, they want to preserve good conditions, not destroy them through strikes. She paused, then added, the script system, conversely, creates exactly the resentment that drives destructive labor action. Men who feel trapped become desperate. Desperate men take risks. Douglas stood abruptly, walking to the window. Below, miners were changing shifts, moving between the mine entrance and their cabins. From this height, they looked small, interchangeable. My father ran this mine for 30 years, he said without turning. Never had a serious strike. Men stayed because the system worked, or because they couldn't leave. Dr. Klein said gently. The silence extended. Thomas wanted to speak, but recognized this moment belonged to his father alone. Finally, Douglas turned back. Even if everything you say is true, and I'm not conceding that converting an entire operation is complicated, where would I get the cash? The nearest bank is 2 days away. How would I prevent workers from spending wages on whiskey and leaving their families destitute? How would I maintain the store's profitability if men can shop elsewhere? All solvable problems, Dr. Klein said. I've documented solutions from successful conversions. Bank arrangements can be made, payroll schedules established. As for the store, make your prices competitive. Men will shop where it's convenient if it's also fair. The key is choice, freedom, dignity. She gathered her papers, preparing to leave. I won't pretend conversion is easy, Mr. Warren. It requires courage to admit a system needs changing, but the evidence is clear. Operations that pay fair wages in real currency outperform those using script, not sometimes, consistently. After she left, father and son sat in heavy silence. She's persuasive, Douglas said finally. She's right. Maybe, Douglas returned to the window, but changing how we've always operated, that's not a decision to make lightly. How lightly should we make the decision to continue as we are? Douglas didn't answer, but he didn't dismiss the question either. And that night, for the first time in 20 years, he took Dr. Klein's research home to read. Continuing from Chapter 4. Over the following days, Douglas found himself trapped between certainty and doubt. He read Dr. Klein's research after dinner. Annotations filling the margins, questions, objections, reluctant acknowledgments. The data was comprehensive. Mines across 3 territories, tracking productivity, worker satisfaction, long-term profitability. Every metric favored cash wages once the initial conversion period passed. But data couldn't erase 20 years of belief. He thought of his father, weathered and practical, who'd built this operation from a played-out shaft and a borrowed stake. Take care of business, the old man had told him on his deathbed. The mine takes care of men who take care of it. Douglas had honored that. He'd provided employment, shelter, access to goods. Men worked 6 days and rested on the 7th. Children grew up with roofs over their heads. What was that if not taking care of them? Yet Thomas's calculations haunted him. $30 earned, $21 purchasing power. That $9 gap multiplied by 90 workers. By 12 months, added up to nearly $10,000 annually flowing from worker pockets into his store's coffers. $10,000 that couldn't be saved, invested, or used for anything except buying from him at his prices. Was that taking care of them? Or taking from them? He sought out his foreman, Jack Patterson, a man who'd worked the mine for 15 years and now managed operations. Jack, honest now, how do the men feel about the script wages? Patterson shifted uncomfortably. They work, Mr. Warren, do their jobs. That's not what I asked. Well, Patterson chose words carefully. Some grumble. Sure, younger fellows especially, one's hoping to save for land or bring families west, but most understand it's how things are. Understanding isn't the same as accepting. No, sir. But men who need work accept what's offered, because they have no choice. Patterson met his eyes. That's the territory we live in. Mr. Warren, choices are scarce for working men, always have been. Douglas dismissed him and sat alone in the office as winter afternoon faded toward darkness. Through the window, he watched lantern light bloom in cabin windows, smoke rising from cook stoves, the camp settling into evening routines. He thought about choice, about freedom, about the difference between providing for men and owning them. The mine disaster might have come regardless, geology and timber and human error combining in ways no system could completely prevent. But later, Douglas would wonder if the universe itself had conspired to force what reason couldn't reach. January brought bitter cold and pressure to maintain production, despite frozen equipment and dangerous conditions. Douglas, unsettled by Dr. Klein's research but unwilling to commit to change, pushed harder to prove his system worked. "We need to make quota," he told Patterson. "Winters when some operations fall behind, not this one." Shifts extended. Men worked 10-hour days in sub-zero temperatures, hauling coal in the dark before dawn and after dusk. The company store sold extra rations coffee, fatback, beans, all on credit that accumulated in ledgers Douglas reviewed nightly. Thomas watched his father retreat into rigidity and wanted to shake him. "You're proving her point," he said one evening. "Driving exhausted men harder isn't sustainable. It's January. Everyone works harder in winter. They're cutting corners on safety. I've seen it. Then Patterson needs to supervise better. Patterson's as exhausted as they are, Father. Please just consider converting. Start with a pilot program, one crew. See how it works." But Douglas had gone stubborn, the way men do when doubt terrifies them more than error. To change now would be admitting Dr. Klein was right, that Thomas was right, that the system he'd defended to O'Brien and run for 2 decades had been wrong all along. Pride is expensive. Douglas would pay its price in blood and grief. Michael O'Brien requested a second meeting. Douglas refused. "I've heard the arguments. My answer hasn't changed." In the camp, tension coiled tight. Younger workers whispered about organizing, about walking out if demands weren't met. Older workers counseled patience, jobs were scarce. Winter was no time for confrontation. Families worried and prayed and made do with less. The company store raised prices on lamp oil and candles, citing supply costs. Douglas approved it without much thought. Thomas saw the increase and felt helpless rage. Patterson reported small violations to Douglas: a support beam not properly seated, a ventilation shaft partially blocked by rockfall, workers too tired to complete full safety protocols before shift end. "Handle it," Douglas said. "That's what foremen are for. Mr. Warren, the men are exhausted. Maybe we could reduce quotas until spring." "We'll make quota." Patterson left without arguing further. He'd worked for Douglas Warren too long to imagine changing his mind once it was set. On the evening of January 17th, Douglas sat in his office reviewing accounts. Production had held steady despite the cold. Store revenue was up. The numbers, as always, told him what he wanted to hear. Below, in the mine's second gallery, 12 men worked by lamplight, drilling holes for the morning's blast charges. They'd been underground since dawn. Every movement required conscious effort against exhaustion. No one noticed when Johnny Brennan, 23 years old and working his 3rd double shift that week, misjudged the depth of a drill hole and weakened a support timber. No one saw the fracture spread through frozen wood, stress accumulating in grain and fiber. At 7:47 p.m., the timber gave way. The sound witnesses later said was like the earth breaking, a roar that started deep and built to thunder, echoing up through shafts and galleries. Then, screaming, dust, and terrible silence. Douglas heard it in his office, felt it through the floorboards, the shudder of catastrophe. He ran. Chaos at the mine entrance, men pouring out, dust-covered and shouting, others grabbing lamps and ropes, organizing rescue parties, disappearing back into darkness. while wives and children gathered in the freezing night. Douglas pushed through the crowd, found Patterson already coordinating. How many? 5 trapped in Gallery 2, maybe 6. We're getting count now. I'm going down. Mr. Warren, I'm going down. He descended with the second rescue party, lamp swinging, breathing dust and fear. The gallery had partially collapsed, blocking the main passage. They dug with hands and shovels, racing against the weight of earth and the possibility of further collapse. They found bodies first. Charlie Brennan, Johnny's older brother, crushed beneath a fallen timber, his lamp still burning beside him, illuminating eyes that would never close. Samuel Wright, skull fractured by falling rock, dead before the dust settled. The living came next. Michael O'Brien, leg broken and bleeding but conscious. Young Tom Kowalski, back crushed but breathing shallow. And Johnny Brennan, the one who'd drilled wrong, trapped beneath rubble and screaming for his mother. They brought them out into freezing night, into the circle of torches and the wailing of women who'd become widows. Douglas helped carry O'Brien to the surface, felt the man's blood soaking through his coat, heard him trying not to scream as broken bone ground against broken bone. Dr. Harrison worked by lamplight, doing what he could. O'Brien and Johnny would live if infection didn't take them. Tom Kowalski would be paralyzed, the back injury too severe for anything but morphine and prayer. But Charlie Brennan and Samuel Wright were beyond help. Their bodies lay in the company store, hastily converted to a morgue, while families gathered to grieve. And that's when Douglas saw what his system had truly built. Martha Kowalski, Tom's young wife, came to his office at midnight, tears streaking her dust-covered face, holding a fistful of company script. "I need to get my husband to Denver," she said, voice breaking. "The doctor says maybe they can help him there, but I need real money for the train, for the hospital. Please, Mr. Warren, I've got $60 in script. Just give me enough cash to get him there." Douglas stared at the colorful bills in her shaking hands. $60, enough to save her husband's spine. Maybe, if the Denver surgeons could do what frontier medicine couldn't. $60 that bought nothing beyond his camp. "I can't," he said, and the words tasted like ash. "Company policy script isn't convertible to cash, but he's going to be a cripple. I'll authorize store credit for supplies you'll need. Food, blankets for the journey." "I don't need your goddamn blankets, real money." Douglas had no answer. The policy was the policy. The system was the system. She threw the script at him, bills fluttering like butterflies, landing on his desk, on his floor. $60 that couldn't save anyone. "I hope you choke on it," she whispered, and left. The widows came next. Mary Brennan, who'd lost both a husband and a brother-in-law in one night. She needed cash for coffins. The undertaker in Silverton wouldn't accept script. Samuel Wright's mother needed money to ship his body back to Missouri for burial in the family plot. Douglas sat in his office surrounded by women holding useless paper, begging for the dignity of burying their dead properly. He sent Peters to town with his personal money to pay the undertaker, authorized shipment of Samuel's body on the company account, made promises he'd find cash somehow. But the damage was done. He saw it in their eyes, the recognition that his wealth was built on their poverty, that his system had made death itself more cruel. Near dawn, Michael O'Brien was brought to the office on a stretcher, legs splinted and dosed with laudanum. His eyes were clear despite the pain. "They couldn't pay for coffins," he said quietly. "Men who worked your mine for years, died in your collapse, and their families couldn't afford the dignity of a proper burial. Does that seem right to you, Mr. Warren?" "It was an accident. It was exhaustion. Men too tired to work safely because you pushed quotas through winter. Don't call it an accident when it was negligence. I didn't want this. No. But you created the conditions for it. And when disaster came, your system made it worse. Script can't buy medicine, can't buy train tickets, can't buy coffins. It's not money, Mr. Warren. It's just paper you use to keep men trapped." Douglas wanted to argue, to defend, to explain, but O'Brien's broken leg accused him. Charlie Brennan's widow accused him. Tom Kowalski, paralyzed at 26, accused him. The colorful script scattered across his floor accused him, After O'Brien was carried out, Douglas sat alone in his office as dawn broke cold and gray. Around him, the evidence of his system ledgers showing debts that would never be cleared, script that couldn't save anyone, a camp full of trapped men he'd told himself he was helping. Thomas found him there, staring at nothing. "I was wrong," Douglas said. His voice sounded distant, unfamiliar. "God help me, I was wrong about all of it." His son didn't speak, just pulled a chair close and sat with him while the camp began to wake, wounded and grieving, to a day that would require more than company script to survive. Douglas Warren called a camp meeting for the following Sunday, giving families time to bury their dead and begin the first rawness of grieving. They gathered in the open space between the store and the mine entrance, 90 workers and their families, faces hard with suspicion and sorrow. Douglas stood on the store's porch, Thomas beside him, and felt the weight of every eye. "I owe you the truth," he began, his voice carried in the frozen air. "The collapse happened because men were too exhausted to work safely. I pushed quotas when I should have reduced them. I prioritized production over your welfare. That's on me. No one else." Silence, waiting. But the system that made everything worse that's been wrong from the start. I didn't see it because I didn't want to. I told myself company script was practical, efficient, normal, what it actually was. He had to force the words out, was a way to keep you dependent. "To take back wages I claim to pay fairly." He pulled a ledger from inside his coat. "I calculated what you've been earning versus what you can actually buy. On average, the store's inflated prices mean you get about 70 cents purchasing power for every dollar of script. That 30% difference multiplied by 90 men. By 20 years, that's theft, legal, maybe common, certainly, but theft all the same." Martha Kowalski stood in the crowd, face still raw from crying. Tom Kowalski sat beside her in a chair, paralyzed legs covered with a blanket. "I can't undo what's happened," Douglas continued. "Charlie Brennan and Samuel Wright are dead because of my policies. Tom Kowalski is injured in ways that may never heal. Michael O'Brien nearly lost his leg. Those consequences are permanent." He paused, gathering courage. "But I can change going forward, effective immediately. The company script system ends. All wages will be paid in United States currency, weekly, at fair market rates. I've consulted with Dr. Klein and reviewed successful conversions elsewhere. Starting wage for experienced miners will be $35 monthly, paid in cash." A murmur went through the crowd, disbelief, hope, suspicion warring on faces. All existing script accounts will be converted to cash value at full face amount, no reduction, no penalties. Company store prices will be reduced to match competitive rates in Silverton. You'll be free to shop there or here. Your choice. The store will succeed by being convenient and fair, not by being your only option. O'Brien, supported by 2 men, spoke from the crowd. "What about the debt some of us carry? Forgiven, all of it. You start fresh with whatever wages you've earned. And if men want to leave, I'll pay out final wages in cash and provide honest references. I won't stop anyone from seeking better opportunities." The crowd shifted, uncertain. This was too large, too sudden. People who'd lived under one system for years couldn't immediately trust its opposite. William Hutchins, the white-haired miner from the original delegation, raised his hand. "Why should we believe you, sir? Mr. Warren, you've run this place the same way for 20 years. Why change now?" "Because my son showed me I was wrong. Because Dr. Klein proved there was a better way. And because—" his voice broke slightly. "Because I watched Martha Kowalski hold $60 that couldn't save her husband. Because I saw widows unable to bury their men with dignity. Because the system I defended made tragedy into torture." He met Hutchins's eyes. "I can't ask you to trust me. I haven't earned it. But watch what I do. Judge me by actions, not promises." Over the next week, Douglas supervised the conversion personally. He brought in cash from banks in Silverton and Denver, enough to cover payroll and account settlements. He sat with each worker, reviewing their accounts, converting script to dollars. Some balances shocked him. Men who'd worked 5 years and had negative balances owed the company despite working 6 days a week. Others had positive balances they'd never been able to access. Douglas paid it all out in cash. Watching men hold real money for the first time in years, the emotional weight was crushing. A man named David Peterson received $48 savings from 3 years that had been locked in script. He stared at the bills, then quietly wept. "I can visit my mother in Kansas City now, he said. "Haven't seen her in 6 years." Douglas processed each transaction, each face, each story of deferred dreams. This was the cost of his system, not just the money but the hope he'd imprisoned. On Saturday, he gathered all the company script, thousands of dollars of colorful paper from the store's safe, from returned accounts, from petty cash. He carried it outside in a wooden crate and set it in a barrel. The camp gathered to watch. Douglas struck a match. "This was a lie," he said simply. "It promised value but delivered bondage. It ends today." The script caught quickly. Bright paper curling and blackening. Flames rose, carrying ash into the winter sky. Workers watched in silence as years of false currency burned away. When the fire died, Douglas spoke again. "The company store remains open under new management and new pricing. The mine continues operating, but with revised quotas and mandatory safety protocols. Anyone who wants to leave with a cash settlement can come to my office Monday morning. Anyone who stays will be paid fairly and treated with the dignity you've always deserved." He didn't wait for response, just turned and walked back to his office, carrying the weight of transformation without the relief of absolution. That evening, Thomas found him there, staring at empty ledgers ready to record a new system. "You did the right thing," Thomas said. "I did the necessary thing. 20 years late." "Better late than never," Douglas shook his head. "Tell that to Charlie Brennan's children." But he opened the new ledger, picked up his pen, and began recording the first week of cash wages. The numbers looked different now, names attached to them, lives behind the figures. He would never again see workers as components in a system. They were men. They deserved freedom. And it had taken death to teach him what living men had tried to tell him all along. Spring came slowly to the Colorado mountains, snow melting grudgingly to reveal brown earth and the first green shoots of renewal. Douglas Warren sat at his desk in the office above the company store, reviewing quarterly accounts. 3 months since the conversion, 3 months of learning to run a mine based on dignity rather than control. The numbers before him told a different story than the ones he'd studied in January. Initial costs had indeed been high, converting accounts, paying out settlements, reducing store prices. The first month showed a 22% decrease in profit. The second month, 18%. But the third month, something shifted. Productivity had climbed. Workers with savings invested in better equipment, showed up healthy because they could afford doctors, worked carefully because they weren't exhausted to the point of collapse. Turnover had dropped to almost nothing. Men who'd been planning to leave stayed when given reason to trust. 3 experienced miners from other camps had requested transfers, attracted by news of fair wages and honest treatment. Douglas hired them, paying market rates, and found their skill level raised the entire operation's quality. The store remained profitable, though modestly. Some workers shopped exclusively there for convenience. Others bought some goods there and saved cash for purchases in Silverton. A few families had started shopping entirely in town, exercising freedom Douglas had finally given them. Each lost sale hurt his pride. Each exercise of choice proved his transformation was real. He ran his finger down the ledger, but differently than before. These weren't just numbers. They were David Peterson's mother's visit to Kansas City, Mary Brennan's new dressmaking business, started with the settlement money from her husband's death, William Hutchins's small house under construction on land he'd finally saved enough to buy. A knock at the door. Michael O'Brien entered, walking with a cane, his leg healed but never quite straight. "Mr. Warren, got a moment?" Of course. O'Brien settled into a chair, stretching his injured leg. "The safety committee wants to propose some changes to the ventilation system in Gallery 3. We've drafted a plan. Got cost estimates from a contractor in Denver." Douglas took the papers, reviewed them. The proposal was thorough, well-researched. This would cost about $800. "Yes, sir, but it would reduce fire risk by half, according to the engineer we consulted." 6 months ago, Douglas would have dismissed this as workers overstepping. Now he saw it for what it was: men invested in their own safety, taking ownership of conditions because they were treated as partners rather than resources. Approved. Have Patterson coordinate with the contractor. O'Brien nodded, then hesitated. I wanted to say what you did in January, converting the wages, forgiving debts. That took courage. Not many men in your position would have admitted error so completely. I didn't do it for praise. I know. That's why it matters. O'Brien stood to leave, then paused again. Charlie Brennan's widow. Mary, she's doing well with her dressmaking. Hired 2 women to help her. She asked me to tell you she doesn't hate you anymore. Still grieves her husband, so I'd say it always will. But she doesn't hate you. After O'Brien left, Douglas sat with that small forgiveness, knowing he didn't deserve it, but grateful for it anyway. Through his window he could see the camp transformed, not physically the same cabins, the same mine entrance, but in subtle ways that spoke to dignity restored. Additions being built on houses, children playing who looked less hungry, workers walking with a different posture, heads up rather than down. Tom Kowalski, paralyzed from the waist down, had started a bookkeeping business from his home. Martha brought him work from other camps, and his meticulous nature made him successful despite his injury. Not the life he'd planned, but a life with purpose and enough money to live with dignity. Dr. Sarah Klein had returned in March to complete her study. She'd spent a week interviewing workers, reviewing accounts, documenting the conversion. Her report would cite Warren Mining Company as the most successful transformation she'd observed. You're the example now, she'd told Douglas. Other owners will look at your numbers and see that fairness works. That'll save more workers than just your own. He hadn't known how to respond to that. Redemption through influence felt too easy, but he'd accepted her words as obligation, if his mistake could prevent others' errors. Perhaps that was a form of amends. Thomas remained, working as operational manager, bringing academic rigor to practical mining. Father and son had found a working partnership built on mutual respect. They still disagreed sometimes, Thomas pushing for faster reforms, Douglas counseling patience, but they disagreed as colleagues, not as judge and defendant. At 4 o'clock, the day shift began emerging from the mine. Douglas watched them from his window, a habit he'd maintained but with different eyes. He knew their names now, knew their families, knew which ones were saving for land, which ones sending money east to bring relatives west, which ones just grateful for honest wages after years of false promises. A worker stopped at the company store, Jake Morrison. Buying supplies for the week, he paid in cash, counted his change, pocketed the remainder. Such a simple transaction, such profound freedom in choosing where and how to spend what he'd earned. Douglas turned back to his ledger. In neat handwriting, he recorded the quarterly summary. Production up 18% from winter baseline. Worker retention 94%. Safety incidents down 40%. Community stability improving. Store revenue decreased but sustainable. Overall assessment. Fair wages create better outcomes for all parties. Initial costs offset by long-term gains in productivity and morale. He paused, then added one more line. Conversion from script to cash wages. Best business decision I've made. Not because of the numbers, though those validate it, because it's right. Treating workers with dignity isn't charity, it's justice. And justice, I'm learning. Good business and good morality combined. He closed the ledger, locked it in the safe, outside. Evening settled over the camp. Lanterns glowed in cabin windows. Smoke rose from cook stoves. The ordinary rhythms of working people building lives within their means. Through his open door came the sound of children playing, their laughter bright and unself-conscious. Before the conversion, that sound had been rare. Children were too hungry, too worried, too aware of their parents' trapped circumstances to play freely. Now they played, and their play was proof of transformation more convincing than any ledger. Douglas descended the stairs to walk through the camp, a ritual he'd adopted since January. Men nodded to him respectfully. Some stopped to talk about production, about safety concerns, about the community garden they were planning for summer. He was no longer the distant owner who saw workers as numbers. He was the man who'd admitted error, who'd chosen justice over pride, who'd learned that taking care of people meant giving them freedom, not controlling their every option. At the small cemetery outside camp, he stopped at 3 graves: Charlie Brennan, Samuel Wright, and a newer one, Tom Henderson's daughter, who succumbed to the lung fever that medicine might have saved if her father could have afforded it in time. "I'm sorry," he said quietly, "for what my system cost you, for learning too late what you tried to teach me while you lived." The graves offered no forgiveness, but they reminded him why the work mattered, why he could never go back, why every dollar he paid in honest wages was both practical business and moral necessity. He walked home through gathering dusk, and for the first time in months, the weight on his shoulders felt bearable. Not gone, it would never be gone completely, but manageable. In his study that night, he wrote a letter to other mining operations in the territory, explaining his conversion to cash wages, offering his ledgers as evidence, encouraging them to consider similar changes. Some would ignore him, some would call him a fool, but if even one operation changed because of his example, more workers would taste freedom. He sealed the letters, addressed them carefully, and placed them in the outgoing mail. Then he opened a new ledger, blank pages, ready to record a system built on respect rather than control, on partnership rather than ownership, on the radical notion that workers deserve dignity, and that dignity, in the end, created prosperity that benefited everyone. The numbers would tell the story, but behind every number would be a name, a family, a life given freedom to flourish or fail by their own choices rather than his constraints. That, Douglas thought as he closed the ledger and extinguished his lamp, was what success actually looked like. Outside, the camp settled into night. Inside his house, for the first time since January, Douglas Warren slept without dreams of collapse and crying widows. The work of amends would continue tomorrow, and the day after, and for however many days he had left. But tonight, he'd earned the beginning of peace.